On a cold March morning, the veterinarian looked at the shattered leg of the 1,500-pound draft horse and delivered his verdict with professional certainty. This animal will never work again. The humane course is euthanasia. The farmer, John Kovac, heard the words, looked at the horse he'd raised from a foal, and said the three words that would define the next 6 months of his life. "We're not done yet." The farmer was John Kovac, 68 years old, and the horse was a Belgian draft gelding named Bud, his primary work animal and constant companion for a decade. The injury was a severe compound fracture, the kind that ends the story for almost any horse. For the vet, it was a clear-cut case of medical necessity. For John, it was a betrayal of a promise. But to understand why he would gamble 6 months of his life against a professional diagnosis, you have to go back 40 years to the first horse he ever lost. In 1963, John Kovac was 21 years old and working his father's farm in southern Minnesota. The horse was a Percheron mare named Bess, the first animal that was truly his responsibility. She caught her hoof in a groundhog hole in the lower pasture, snapping the pastern bone clean through. The local vet, an older man who'd seen it all, took one look and shook his head. "Can't fix it. She's in pain. It's the kindest thing." John's father agreed. It was a working animal, not a pet. The economics were clear. John held Bess's head as the injection was administered. He felt her go heavy against him, and then she was gone. He didn't argue. He was young, and he trusted the authority in the room. But for 40 years, the question lingered in the back of his mind. Was that really the only way? Let me tell you about John Kovac's operation. Because by 2008, it wasn't just a farm. It was a system built around one animal. John ran 120 acres of hay and pasture, supplying several local stables. His tractor was old, but his primary motive power was Bud, a Belgian draft gelding weighing over a ton. Bud plowed the snow in winter, dragged logs from the woodlot, harrowed the pastures, and even gave wagon rides at the county fair. He was the farm's engine, but also its soul. John's wife, Marnie, would say Bud was the only creature on earth who listened to John more than she did. Their son, David, had grown up learning to drive the tractor, but he learned patience from grooming Bud. The veterinarian was Stephen Hayes, 44 years old, a partner at the large animal clinic in Rochester. He'd been the Kovac's vet for 15 years. He was practical, compassionate, and saw his role as an advocate for the animal's welfare. On that morning in March, his diagnosis wasn't made lightly. Bud had been found down in the paddock, his left foreleg bent at a sickening angle. An X-ray confirmed a comminuted fracture of the cannon bone, multiple fragments. "John," Stephen said, pointing to the film on his truck's viewer, "look at this. The bone is in pieces. There's significant soft tissue damage. The pain is immense and will be constant. Even with a miracle surgery, the risk of infection, laminitis in the other leg, the chance he could ever bear weight again is almost zero. Keeping him alive means prolonged suffering for a hope that doesn't exist." The standard of care was clear. For a draft horse with this injury, euthanasia was the recommended course. It was in the textbooks. It was what Stephen had been taught. To recommend anything else, he believed, would be unethical. He gave John the estimate for a surgical referral anyway, knowing it was a formality. $25,000, maybe more, with months of intensive care and no guarantee. He watched the old farmer's face, expecting the grim acceptance he'd seen so many times before. John didn't look at the estimate. He looked at Bud, whose head was cradled in Marnie's lap, his breathing shallow and pained. "You say the chance is almost zero," John said, his voice low. "Almost isn't zero," Stephen sighed. "John, in medical terms, it's zero. It's the kind of injury we don't come back from." "We?" John asked, finally turning to him. "You mean they?" "The horses. But you're not talking about this horse. You're talking about a statistic. Bud's not a statistic." That's when John said the three words, "We're not done yet." Let me tell you about the first 48 hours, because that's when everyone thought John would cave. Stephen stabilized the leg with a heavy bandage and a splint, administered strong painkillers, and left with a heavy heart. He was certain he'd be back within the week to put Bud down. The farm, meanwhile, went into crisis mode. David drove in from the cities. Neighbors offered condolences, assuming the decision was merely delayed. Marnie looked at the hay schedule and the upcoming spring work and saw a financial abyss. But John was already in the barn, on the phone. He called the veterinary school at the University of Minnesota. He called a specialized equine hospital in Kentucky. He called a farrier known for orthopedic work. Each call was the same, a description of the injury, a pause, then a gentle but firm recommendation for euthanasia. The consensus was absolute. John took notes. He learned terms like external fixation, pulsed electromagnetic field therapy, and hydrotherapy. He also heard the same warning over and over. The care will be 24/7. You'll need to keep him still. You'll need to manage pain without oversedating him. You'll need to prevent pressure sores. The cost, both financial and emotional, will be enormous, and you're likely just prolonging the inevitable. On the second night, John sat at the kitchen table with Marnie and David. The numbers were on a notepad: the initial medical costs, the cost of renting a tractor to do Bud's work, the potential loss of hay contracts if the work didn't get done. It added up to more than the farm's emergency fund. David, pragmatic and worried, laid it out. "Dad, he's a horse, a great horse, but he's 16 years old. Even if by some miracle he walks again, he'll never pull a plow. You'd be spending everything to retire him." John was quiet for a long time. He looked at the photograph on the wall, a picture of him as a young man with Bess, taken a week before she died. "I spent 40 years wondering if I gave up on Bess too easy because I was scared and poor and listened to everyone else," he said. "If I do it again now, with Bud, with all I know, then the answer to that question is yes, and I can't live with that." The decision was made. They would try. But to understand the sheer scale of what John Kovac was attempting, you have to understand the anatomy of a miracle. And you have to meet the one man in the country who didn't tell John it was impossible. His name was Arlen Finch, and he was a 72-year-old retired farrier turned equine orthotics specialist living outside Lexington. He didn't have a website. He didn't work for a hospital. He answered the phone on the fourth ring, and when John described the fracture, Arlen didn't sigh or offer condolences. He said, "Tell me about the horse's temperament. Is he a fighter or a quitter?" John, stunned, said, "He's the stubbornest creature I've ever known." Arlen replied, "Good. Stubborn is what we need. Send me the x-rays." Arlen Finch had spent 50 years working on racehorses, show jumpers, and draft animals. He believed modern veterinary medicine gave up too quickly on severe orthopedic cases in large horses, not for lack of skill, but for lack of time and economics. His specialty was designing custom external support systems, part cast, part brace, that could stabilize a leg for the months needed for bone to knit. He'd seen it work a handful of times. He'd seen it fail more often. But he never told a client it was impossible until he'd seen the images. 3 days later, Arlen called back. "The fracture is bad," he said, "but it's clean. The fragments are large. There's a chance, a slim one, if we can immobilize it perfectly and if the horse has the will to lie still. I can build a brace, but I won't ship it. You'll have to come here and you'll have to stay for 2 weeks while I fit it and teach you the care protocol." John asked the cost. Arlen named a figure that was half the surgical quote but still a staggering sum for the Kovacs. "Mr. Kovac," Arlen said, "this isn't a medical procedure you're buying. You're buying a lesson in patience. And you're buying my phone number for the next 6 months because you'll be calling me every time the horse sneezes. You sure you want that?" John looked at Bud in the sling they'd rigged in the barn. "We'll be there," he said. "Let me tell you about the journey to Kentucky, because it was the first test of whether the plan was viable. Bud could not bear weight on the injured leg. He could not be loaded into a standard horse trailer. John and David had to rent a specialized large animal ambulance with a hydraulic lift. The fuel cost alone was astronomical. Stephen Hayes, though convinced it was a fool's errand, still provided sedatives for the trip and the phone number of a colleague in Lexington. "For when it goes wrong," he said, not unkindly. Marnie stayed behind to manage the farm, watching the savings account drain in real time. For 2 weeks, John lived in a rented camper next to Arlen's workshop. The brace was a work of art and engineering, carbon fiber and medical-grade polymer molded from a scan of Bud's good leg, with adjustable tension straps and a rigid shell that encased the leg from knee to hoof. Arlen's process was methodical, gentle, and endless. He would fit the brace, watch Bud take a few tentative steps in the padded stall, then take it off and shave a millimeter more here, add a pad there. The goal was perfect, even pressure. Any pressure sore could lead to infection, and infection would mean amputation or death. Arlen's first lesson was the most important. The bone will heal if we give it peace, he said, but the mind is what we're really fixing. A horse that's bored is a horse that fights the brace. A horse that's hopeless is a horse that gives up and won't get up. The rehabilitation plan wasn't just physical therapy, it was a schedule of mental engagement, brushing, hand grazing for 5 minutes, listening to the radio. John took notes like a medical student. They returned to Minnesota with the brace, a binder of instructions, and a monthly payment plan to Arlen that would stretch for a year. The farm they came back to was different. The spring work was behind. A neighbor had plowed the fields for a fee. The haying schedule was in jeopardy. The community's quiet skepticism had hardened into open concern. At the co-op, John overheard 2 other farmers. "Kavak's gone sentimental in his old age," one said. "That's a working asset, not a family member. He's gonna lose the farm over a horse." John didn't respond. He bought the special feed Arlen recommended and went home. Now let me tell you about the routine. Because for the next 4 months, John Kavak's life was measured in 3-hour intervals, day and night. The brace had to be removed, the leg cleaned and inspected for rubs or swelling, then the brace reapplied with exact tension. Bud had to be rotated in his sling system to prevent bed sores. His good legs needed gentle massage to maintain circulation. Every day, John would do passive range of motion exercises on the injured leg, moving the joints just a few degrees to prevent them from freezing. Marnie and David took shifts, but the core responsibility was John's. He slept in the barn on a cot. He lost 15 pounds. The financial pressure was a constant hum. They dipped into the retirement fund. They took out a line of credit against the land, the very thing John had spent a lifetime avoiding. Stephen Hayes would visit every other week to monitor for infection or laminitis. His visits were polite, professional, and carried an unspoken verdict. "I'm waiting for the moment I have to say, 'I told you so.'" The first major crisis hit in month 2. A red, angry line appeared on Bud's leg under the brace edge. Infection. Stephen was called. He took a culture and prescribed a powerful antibiotic. "This is what I was talking about, John," he said. "The environment under that brace is perfect for bacteria. This could go septic fast." John called Arlen in a panic. Arlen walked him through a brutal cleaning regimen with antiseptic soaks and told him to adjust the strap alignment. "This is the war," Arlen said. "You just lost a battle, don't lose the will to fight." For 72 hours, John barely slept, cleaning and redressing the wound every few hours. The infection receded. But the incident changed Stephen's perspective. He saw the raw, obsessive care John was providing, care that went far beyond standard veterinary nursing. It wasn't just duty, it was a form of communication between the old man and the horse. During his next visit, Stephen didn't just check the leg. He watched John talk to Bud as he worked, a steady, calm monologue about the weather, the farm, old memories. He saw Bud's ear twitch toward the sound. "You know," Stephen said, packing his kit, "the textbooks don't have a chapter on this." John didn't look up. "On what?" "On whatever it is you're doing," Stephen said. He didn't say it was working, but he stopped talking about inevitability. "Let me tell you about the turning point. Month 4. The financial rope was at its end. The line of credit was maxed. The hay contract was in jeopardy because John hadn't been able to put up the first cutting. David sat his parents down at the kitchen table. "We have to talk about selling the back 40 acres, he said. "It's that or we lose everything." That night, John went to the barn. It was his shift. He performed the routine, clean, inspect, massage, rebrace. He was exhausted in his bones. For the first time, a thought crept in. Maybe they're all right. Maybe this is just pride. He finished and sat on a bale of hay, head in his hands. After a minute, he felt a nudge on his shoulder. Bud, without any command or cue, had shifted his weight and stretched his neck over the stall gate to reach him. The horse lowered his head and rested his massive chin on John's knee. A deep, quiet sigh escaped him. It wasn't a gesture of pain. It was one of companionship. In that moment, John didn't see a broken animal or a financial disaster. He saw the partner he'd made a promise to. He called David the next morning. "Sell the acres," he said. "We're seeing this through." The sale went through, saving the operation but carving a permanent piece off the farm. The community saw it as tragic stubbornness, but something else was happening. At month 5, during an X-ray checkup, Stephen Hayes saw something that made him lean in close to the viewer. He took a second set of images. He was quiet for a long time. "John," he said, his voice different. "Come look at this." The fracture line was still visible, but a faint, cloudy bridge of new bone was forming between the largest fragments. It was called callus. It was the first sign of healing. It was the medical impossibility appearing on schedule. Stephen Hayes, the pragmatic vet, had to reconcile two conflicting facts. His professional training told him this shouldn't be happening. The evidence on the screen told him it was. He looked from the X-ray to the old farmer standing beside him, and for the first time he didn't see a deluded client. He saw a colleague in the treatment of this animal. "Okay," Stephen said, letting out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for months. "What's the next step Arlen recommends?" The next step was the most dangerous one yet. It was time to see if the bone could bear weight. And it was time to tell John Kovac what Arlen Finch had really been working toward all along. It wasn't just about walking. It was about pulling. John thought Arlen was talking about light farm work. He was. The brace was never about making him a pasture pet, Arlen explained over the phone. The bone needs progressive stress to remodel and get strong, gentle stress. For a draft horse, that stress comes from pulling. Not tomorrow, not next month. But eventually, if we do this right, he needs to lean into a harness again. That's the final test of the repair. John was silent. The idea of asking that leg to pull anything felt like tempting fate. "And if it fails?" John asked. "Then we'll know we reached the limit of what was possible," Arlen said. "But if you don't ask the question, you spend all this time and money for half an answer." Stephen Hayes was horrified when John told him. "That's insane, John. The biomechanics of pulling put tremendous torque on the cannon bone. You'd be risking a catastrophic refracture. My job is to prevent animal suffering, not enable a nostalgic experiment." For the first time, the collaboration between farmer and vet cracked under the weight of diverging end goals. Stephen saw a successful outcome as a horse that lived comfortably in a field. John and Arlen saw a successful outcome as a horse that returned to its purpose. The weight-bearing phase began with terrifying delicacy. The brace was modified to allow slight flexion. Bud was led from his stall, the injured leg touching the ground for the first time in 5 months. He took 3 wobbly steps, then lifted the leg again, unsure. The process was achingly slow. 5 minutes of standing twice a day, then 10, then walking the length of the barn aisle. Each step was monitored by John and recorded in a logbook that now had Stephen's notes in the margins too. The new bone held. Let me tell you about the summer of judgment. Because as Bud began to move more, the farm became a spectacle. Neighbors and curious locals would find excuses to stop by, offering to drop off a tool or borrow some feed, just to catch a glimpse of the horse that shouldn't be walking. The narrative in the community began to shift from foolish old man to maybe he's onto something. But with that shift came new pressure. If Bud failed now, after coming this far, the fall would be even harder. David, who had been the voice of financial reason, found himself becoming the project's logistics manager. He researched therapeutic pulling exercises. He built a custom sled with adjustable weight, starting with empty wooden pallets. He also made a difficult calculation. The farm needed income, and soon. The hay had been cut by a custom crew at great expense. They needed a win, not just a medical milestone, but a tangible one. Arlen Finch flew to Minnesota. He hadn't seen Bud since fitting the brace. When the old gelding was walked out into the sunlight, Arlen didn't smile or celebrate. He got down on his knees and ran his hands over the leg, over the brace, feeling for heat, for swelling, for any subtle misalignment. He watched Bud walk. He had John hook him to the empty sled. Bud leaned forward instinctively and the sled skidded a few feet on the dirt. Arlen nodded. "The leg tracked true," he said. "The mind is still in the game. Now we add weight, slowly. One concrete block at a time. You log every pull. Any hesitation, any favor, you stop." This became the new routine. Every other day, Bud would be harnessed to the sled. John would add a single cinder block weighing 40 pounds. Bud would pull it 50 feet. They watched his every movement, his breathing, the placement of the injured leg. The logbook entries grew detailed. July 14th, added block number 3. 120 pounds total, pull clean, no head tossing. Evening, no swelling. But the real conflict was brewing inside Stephen Hayes. As a scientist, he was observing a case that defied the literature. As an ethicist, he was deeply troubled. He called a colleague at the veterinary college. "I have a client with a draft horse, comminuted cannon fracture, now pulling weight in rehab. What's your protocol?" The answer was immediate and firm. "That's contraindicated. You're risking a welfare issue. You should advise cessation." Stephen was caught between professional standards and the evidence in front of him. A horse that was not showing signs of pain, that was gaining muscle and spirit. He presented John with an ultimatum in early August. "John, I can't, in good conscience, continue to provide veterinary oversight for a pulling regimen. It goes against standard of care. If you continue, you'll need to find another vet." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of professional boundary. John accepted it quietly. "I understand," he said. "Thank you for everything you've done to get him this far." Stephen left the farm that day feeling he had done the right thing, but also feeling a strange sense of loss. He was no longer part of the story. Now let me tell you about the ad in the county paper, because this is where a private recovery became a public proposition. David, without telling his father, placed a small notice in the agricultural classifieds. "Experienced draft horse available for light demonstration pulls, festival, educational events. Contact Kovac Farm." The phone rang 2 days later. It was the organizer of the Rice County Fair, held over Labor Day weekend. They had a traditional horse pulling exhibition. They needed a comeback story for the opening ceremony. A symbolic light pull in front of the crowd. Was Bud up for it? John was furious when David told him. "You want to make him a sideshow after everything," David countered. "I want to pay the feed bill. I want to show everyone who doubted you that they were wrong." And the organizer promised, "It's just the empty sled, a walk across the arena. It's a victory lap, Dad." The fair offered $500. It was money they desperately needed. After a long, tense silence, John agreed, but he added one condition. They would not use the word comeback. It was a demonstration of recovery. The fair was in 2 weeks. The pressure now was not just physical but performative. The weight training continued, but now with the added variable of noise, crowds, and strange surroundings. They practiced with a radio blaring. They had neighbors come over to clap and shout. Bud, ever steady, took it in stride, but John's nerves were fraying. The risk of public failure loomed larger than any medical setback. 3 days before the fair, during a routine training pull with 6 blocks, 240 pounds, Bud stopped halfway through the track. He simply planted his feet and refused to move. John urged him gently. Nothing. David checked the harness, the sled, everything was fine. After 5 minutes, Bud resumed and finished the pull as if nothing had happened, but the message was clear. The horse was communicating a limit. John called Arlen that night. "He told me no today," John said. Arlen listened, then asked, "Was he in pain, lame?" "No," John said, "just no." Arlen's reply was simple. "Then you listen, he's smarter than all of us. Maybe he was tired, maybe it was too much. You have the data point, now respect it." The day before the fair, Stephen Hayes drove out to the farm unannounced. He found John in the barn grooming Bud. "I heard about the fair," Stephen said. "I came to say I was wrong to walk away, not about the medicine but about my role. If you're going to do this, you should have a vet on site. I'd like to be that vet, not as an endorsement but as a safeguard, for him." John nodded, his throat tight. The team, fractured, was whole again, at least for this moment. The morning of the fair dawned hot and humid. The pulling arena was a sea of deep, soft dirt. The main competition, with teams pulling sleds loaded with thousands of pounds, would happen in the afternoon. Their demonstration was scheduled for 10 a.m., just after the opening ceremonies. As John led Bud off the trailer, the scale of the event hit him. Hundreds of people lined the fence. The grandstand was full. Other pullers, men with massive Percherons and Belgians, watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. This was their world, a world of pure function and power, and Bud was an anomaly. The announcer's voice boomed over the loudspeaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin our official competition, we have a special demonstration from Kavek Farm. This is Bud, a Belgian draft horse who suffered a life-threatening leg injury earlier this year. Through months of dedicated care, he's here today to show us what recovery looks like." The crowd applauded, a warm, supportive sound. John hooked Bud to the empty stone boat sled. He looked at Stephen, who gave a thumbs up from the sidelines. He looked at David and Marnie in the front row. He patted Bud's neck. "Just a walk, old friend, just a walk." He gave the command. Bud leaned into the harness. The sled moved smoothly. They walked the required 50 feet to the other end of the arena. The crowd cheered. It was done. The safe, symbolic victory was achieved. But as John turned Bud to head back to the gate, something happened. The big horse stopped. He looked at the deep, groomed dirt of the pulling track. He looked at the weighted sleds waiting for the real competition. He sniffed the air and his ears pricked forward. He took a half step toward the nearest competitor's sled, as if curious. Then he turned his head and looked directly at John. It was a clear, intelligent, questioning look. And in that moment, John Kavek faced a decision that had nothing to do with medicine or money or reputation. It was a question of faith. He made a choice that would change the story from a recovery into a legend. He pointed Bud toward the official pulling sled, loaded with weight for the lightweight class. The lightweight sled was set at 1,500 pounds, a token weight for the competition but an impossible mountain for a horse with a surgically mended leg. The pull master, a grizzled man named Ray, walked over. "You sure about this, John? That's real weight." John's eyes were fixed on Bud. "He's asking," John said simply. Ray shrugged, waved to the flagmen. The crowd, sensing the unscripted drama, fell into a hush. John positioned Bud before the sled. He did not give a pep talk. He leaned close, his forehead against the horse's neck, and whispered something no microphone could catch. Then he stepped back, took the lines, and gave the command. Bud leaned forward. The harness tightened. For a second, nothing happened. The sled didn't budge. A murmur went through the crowd. Then Bud shifted his weight, dug his massive hooves into the dirt, and pushed. The sled jerked, then began to move. An inch, 6 inches, a foot. He did not sprint. It was a slow, deliberate, grinding pull, every muscle in his body corded with effort. The crowd was silent, watching the injured leg, watching for a stumble, a sign of pain. The leg held. It planted, it pushed, it bore the strain. Bud kept moving. 5 feet, 10. He needed to make a full pull of 27 feet to register a score. At 15 feet, he paused, blowing hard. John's heart stopped, but it was just a breath. Bud gathered himself and pulled again. The final few feet were agonizingly slow, the sled scraping through the dirt. When the front of the sled crossed the 27-foot mark, a roar erupted from the grandstand that shook the air. Bud stood, sides heaving, head low. Stephen Hayes was at his side in an instant, running his hands down the leg, feeling for heat, for pulses. He looked up at John, his professional composure gone, replaced by pure wonder. "It's cool," he shouted over the noise. "The leg is cool. He's sound." John unhooked the tugs, and Bud, exhausted, turned and nudged him as if to say, "Okay, that's done." The official score was recorded, 1,500 pounds. It placed last in the lightweight class, but it wasn't a competition entry. It was a declaration. The story of the pull spread through the fairgrounds faster than the results. By afternoon, people were lining up at the Kavek trailer not to gawk, but to shake John's hand, to pat Bud's neck, to ask about the brace. The farmers who'd called him sentimental now looked at him with a new respect. It wasn't about sentiment. It was about grit, and a farmer respected grit above all else. Let me tell you about the check, because the real victory wasn't in the dirt of the arena. The fair organizer found John later that day. "That was the story of the fair," he said. "We took up a collection from the pulling committee." He handed John an envelope. Inside was cash, $2,300, more than the fee, more than they'd seen in months. It wasn't charity, it was tribute. It paid off the last of Arlen Finch and filled the truck with fuel. But the true payoff was what happened in the following year. Bud's leg grew stronger. The brace was retired, replaced by a supportive boot for heavy work. He returned to light farm duties, hauling firewood, harrowing the garden. Stephen Hayes, transformed by the experience, began presenting Bud's case at regional veterinary conferences, not as a standard to follow, but as a case study in the limits of prognosis and the role of owner dedication. He and John became friends, often consulting on other difficult cases. The farm stabilized. The notoriety brought a new business, families booking farm visits to see the miracle horse. John, initially reluctant, saw it as a way to keep the land without overworking it. Marnie ran the visitor side, turning a liability into a modest asset. And then in the fall of the next year, Arlen Finch called. There was a regional draft horse exhibition in Poland, Wisconsin, a showcase, not a brutal competition. He thought Bud should be there. Not to win, Arlen said, to close the circle. John was 70 now, Bud was 17. They went. This time there was no drama, no crisis. Bud competed in the Veterans Showcase class. He pulled 1,800 pounds cleanly, smoothly. He didn't place last. He took a third-place ribbon, a small thing, but John framed it. Afterward, a young farmer approached John. He had a draft mare with a tendon injury. Every vet said to put her down. He'd heard John's story. "What do I do?" he asked. John didn't tell him what to do. He said, "You listen to your vet. You learn everything you can about the injury, and then you listen to your horse and you listen to your gut, and you be ready to do the work no matter what anyone says." The young man nodded, tears in his eyes. He'd found the permission he was looking for. Let me tell you about the last conversation with Stephen Hayes. It happened years later on a quiet afternoon at the farm. Bud was 23 years old, retired, grazing in the sun. His leg was stiff in the cold, but he was sound. Stephen was retiring from practice. The two men sat on the porch watching the old horse. "I was wrong, you know," Stephen said. "That first day, not medically. Medically, I was right, but I was wrong about the part that matters most. I saw a broken leg." "You saw a broken promise." John shook his head. "You were doing your job, I was doing mine. My job was to know my animal better than anyone else, even you." Now let me tell you the final detail, the one that ties it all together. In John's barn, on a shelf above the workbench, there are two objects side by side. One is the third-place ribbon from Wisconsin. The other is a worn horseshoe, the one Bud was wearing the day he broke his leg. John never had it reworked or cleaned. The mud from that March paddock is still caked in its creases. He keeps it there as a reminder, not of the break, but of the moment before it. The last moment of normalcy. A reminder that everything can change in a single step, and that what you do after that step is what defines you. Bud lived to be 28 years old, a remarkable age for a draft horse that had done heavy work. He died peacefully in his pasture on his feet with John beside him. They buried him on the farm under the old oak at the crest of the hill. John Kovac is still there, farming the land with his son, though the work is lighter now. Sometimes people still ask him why he did it. He doesn't talk about miracles or defiance. He says, "I had a partner who needed me to fight for him, so I fought." And every time he says it, he looks toward the hill and he smiles. That's how the story ends. Not with a trophy, but with a piece of land still owned, a family still together, and a debt of loyalty paid in full. But the reason this story matters, the reason it sticks with you, isn't about a horse or a farmer. It's about the space between what is probable and what is possible, and who gets to decide what lives in that space. So let me ask you this final question. When the expert in the room, the one with the degrees and the experience and the data, looks you in the eye and says, "This is the end," what do you do? Do you accept the verdict, trusting the boundaries of what is known? Or do you look past them into the unknown, guided by something that can't be measured on an X-ray or a balance sheet? John Kovac's story isn't an argument against veterinary science. Stephen Hayes was right, by every standard metric of his profession. The story is an argument for a different kind of knowledge. The knowledge that comes from years of shared silence at dawn, from knowing the meaning behind a flick of an ear, from a promise made not in words, but in daily care. It's about the sovereignty that exists in a partnership between a being and its keeper. We live in a world that prioritizes efficiency, probability, and the clean, logical answer. And most of the time, that serves us well. But this story exists in the exception. It lives in the messy, expensive, emotionally exhausting territory where logic ends and something else begins. Call it faith, call it stubbornness, call it love. Its name doesn't matter. Its outcome does. For every bud, there are 100 horses, 1,000, for whom the prognosis was correct, and the kindest end was the one recommended. This story does not judge those decisions. It simply carves out space for the rare, defiant few. It asks us to consider that the map of what is possible is not drawn solely by experts. It is redrawn in real time by the stubborn few who refuse to stop at the edge of the known world. The vet saw a catastrophic fracture. The farmer saw a broken promise. Both were true. The history of progress in medicine, in technology, in human endeavor is written by those who believed the second truth was worth fighting for, even when the first truth said the fight was over. John Kovac and Bud are gone now, but the question they leave behind is, it's there in your own life, in the moments when you're told something can't be done, a relationship can't be mended, a dream is too far gone. The question is never about ignoring the evidence. It's about asking what other evidence might exist, hidden in the margins, waiting for someone stubborn enough to look for it. What in your life lives in that space between probable and possible? And what are you willing to risk to find out? If you found a lesson in that quiet, stubborn fight, consider subscribing. We track down more stories like this, stories where the human spirit collides with the immovable object, and sometimes, just sometimes, finds a way to move it. Thanks for watching.